Hi everyone, it's Sarah and welcome to Module 1 of the Jumpstart Your Art Collection program. Today we're going to be talking about Medium, but before we start, I want to give you just a brief introduction to the website and how you can use it. So after you log in, you'll see these three links on the right side of the page for videos, worksheets, and resources. I advise you to listen to the videos first and the different lectures, and then after that, complete the accompanying worksheet. You can email me the worksheet and I'll give you personalized feedback. It's not obligatory, of course, that you do the worksheets, and even though the course is 5 weeks long, take as much time as you need to complete all the work. There are absolutely no deadlines in this course. I really want you to take your time and enjoy it and learn as much as you can. And as with many things in life, you will get as much out of this program as you put into it. So I do hope you consider filling out the worksheets. They're developed to really put into practice what I talk about in the lectures and to get you going out there into the world, going to art galleries, going to auction houses, start becoming more comfortable looking at works of art and talking to art professionals. There's also the resources section, and that's a great section to go to whenever, if you're doing research on an artist, if you want to learn more about a certain medium. There are different organizations listed there, different art organizations. So it's a great place to go to, and it's constantly being updated by me. So I hope you visit it frequently. At the very end of the course, after you send in all 5 worksheets, I will send you a personalized lookbook of artists, galleries, and other information that are specifically tailored to your tastes. I do this for clients. It's about a $300 value. It's basically a very simple art advisor book. So it really will help you go out there into the marketplace, compile everything you've learned, and find that first work of art that you really love. Of course, if you have any questions, please email me. It's sarah@macmillanfineprints.com. I love hearing from you, and I really want to build a relationship and get to know all of you, even over this virtual classroom that we have here. So with that said, let's get started. This week we're going to be talking about Medium. Medium is really important because you can't really understand and properly analyze or appreciate a work of art unless you understand how it's made. Also, to reach a more advanced level of connoisseurship, you have to understand Medium. And hopefully after the end of the course today, you'll understand why this is so important. So today we'll be talking about different identification techniques, how to look at different manipulations of the same medium, how artists use the same medium in different ways, what makes a great oil painting a great oil painting, a great engraving, and how you can tell the difference between different media when you're looking at something. So let's dive in. So to talk about oil paintings, let's begin with a brief history. Giorgio Vasari, whom some of you might be familiar with from your various art history studies, was a 16th century art critic and historian, and he credited Jan van Eyck with inventing oil painting around 1420. It's now commonly known that oil paints had been used for many centuries earlier. However, what the Dutch did in the 15th century that was innovative is that they developed a sophisticated method of paint application. So they would layer increasingly transparent paint over more opaque underlayers, and it created a really rich, jewel-like colored composition, which was impossible in egg tempera, and egg tempera was what was being used to make paintings before this technique was really developed. So this new method allowed for more realistic color effects than were previously seen, and if you're familiar with Italian painting from the 16th century, 15th century, as well as Northern painting, Netherlandish painting of the same period, you'll understand what I'm talking about and just how rich the colors really were in Northern painting that Italian artists just weren't able to achieve. So let's look at an example. This is a This is a work by a Dutch artist named Abraham van Beuren. And so I want you to keep in your mind the idea that understanding a medium really makes you appreciate a work of art. So I used to think still lifes were incredibly boring. There was no story, there were no composition, or there's a composition, but there weren't any figures. It was dull to me. But once I really understood oil paint and how it was made and how sophisticated the process was, still lifes became much more interesting to me. Because in still lifes of this time period, the artist was really showing off their skills. So take, for example, this work. In here you have a lobster, you have a silver candlestick, you have different types of fruit, you have a little, looks like a Delftware bowl with fruit. The lemon peel is very intricately done. You see a velvet or a satin tablecloth. And what the artist is able to do with the use of oil paint is he's able to properly depict all of the different textures. So he shows the sheen of the glass as being very different than the hardness of the cooked lobster. And you see this in many different still lifes of the time period. Animals with fur, again, the reflections of glass. Northern artists really understood the qualities of oil paint and how they could use its ability to create these really rich colors, these very detailed compositions, and they exploited that to create really beautiful paintings. Early commercially available oil paint was sold in pig bladders, which allowed for transportation, but it was, of course, very impractical. So a major breakthrough came in the 19th century when oil paint was commercially stored and sold in metal paint tubes, which is still what you see today if you go to your local Blick or any other art supply store. And oil paint did eventually replace the egg tempera paint, which had been the primary medium in the West, because it has much better handling properties, and oil paint dries at a much slower rate, so artists are really able to manipulate and blend the paint a lot more. It's very, very versatile. It can be applied very thickly, very thinly. Like you see here, it's quite thin. It can be smooth, it can be rough, transparent, opaque. So it has all these different qualities that were really exploited by the artist. So we looked at an example by an old master, and now I want to take a look at a modern example to see how the use of oil really changes. This is a work by the artist Charles Pollock. Pollock was the older brother of Jackson Pollock, and he was a really interesting artist. I actually just saw an exhibition by him in Venice at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum, and it completely opened my eyes to him. He began his career with Thomas Hart Benton, and he was very much a regionalist, and as he grew, he became more interested in abstraction. So this is obviously a work from the abstract part of his career. And unlike the Dutch work we just saw, here oil paint is not used to depict a realistic depiction of something else. It's not really a trompe l'oeil. Here the oil paint is just the paint. And Pollock layers a very, very thin amount of the paint on the canvas, so you can see how the black bleeds into the yellow and the blue here. And if you look very closely, you can see the canvas and the knots of the canvas that stick through. And even if you look at the yellow, you see the different gradations in tone of the yellow just from the way that the canvas and the paint interacts with one another. So this abstract quality really allows us as viewers to appreciate how the colors interact with one another. And it gives it this sense of materiality because we see the paint, we recognize it, we see the canvas and the knots of the canvas. So it's a very different work in that sense. It's really helpful to look at abstract works when thinking about medium, because if you notice when I described it just now, really what I was just describing was how the oil paint works on the canvas and how the different parts of the work actually interact with one another. There's not narrative, there aren't figures to distract us from the medium itself. So whether you're looking at a painting, a print, or a drawing, start looking at the work of art in this way, where you start with describing how the medium is manipulated by the artist, rather than this is the story that the painting is telling. And I guarantee you that it'll really make you look at art in a very different way, and it will really enrich your experience. Form and understanding form is so important in making your level, or I should say heightening your level of connoisseurship. So that's why I put medium as the first module of this course, to really hopefully get you guys looking at art in a very different way. Before moving on from oil painting, I want to talk about impasto. So I mentioned a few minutes ago, oil paint can be applied very thinly or very thickly. We saw it applied in both those examples very thinly. And here's some examples of when it's very thick. And when an artist applies oil paint very thickly, as you can see here on the left, you see the clumps of paint which stick out off the canvas. This is called impasto. It's I-M-P-A-S-T-O. And again, it's the opposite of what Pollock was doing. And Vincent van Gogh utilized this a lot if you look at his paintings. It's difficult to tell when it's photographed, but if you have seen them in person, you'll be familiar with what I'm talking about. So I mention this because it serves as a reminder that even if you think of an image of a painting as a two-dimensional object, this impasto makes the painting have a three-dimensional quality, and it really affects the overall understanding of the painting. So being very aware of how the artist uses the medium, whether they choose to let the canvas show through, or whether they choose to include impasto, or if it's both. In the example on the top left where you see the canvas and you also see the impasto, all of those are choices made by the artist. How they manipulate a certain media impacts the overall understanding of a work of art. So don't forget, when you're looking at a work of art, to really look at the form itself. Now I'd like to move on to talk about works on paper. And I would first like to discuss the difference between watercolor and gouache. The first time I encountered a gouache, I was working in a gallery and I was cataloging, and I had hundreds of things to catalog. This person I worked for was very disorganized. So I was plugging along and I pulled this one work out, and I had no idea what I was looking at. I knew it wasn't a watercolor, but it looked very similar to a watercolor, and after a lot of Googling, I realized that it was a gouache. So both watercolor and gouache are water-based, and some of you might be familiar with watercolors, have done them yourself, but I think gouache is a little less common, so I wanted to make you all aware of it. A watercolor you'll see on the top here, these are both works by John Marin, but on the top you can really get a sense of what watercolor looks like. The colors are transparent, they're, for lack of a better word, watery. You can see how the colors, particularly on the bottom with the blue, something is very transparent, and then all of a sudden very much more opaque. It's just the way that the water actually interacts with the watercolor itself, which gives it that kind of look. Gouache, on the other hand, is opaque. It's matte. It doesn't have those great distinctions between translucent and opaque that you'll see in watercolor. It's much, much flatter. So you can see that in the bottom example just a little bit. If you look at the blues, there's no transparency to it, but it is still a water-based medium. It's done in a very similar manner, and it's actually I quite like them now that I've seen quite a few of them. It was really popular in the early 20th century, particularly with American artists. So if you're looking at an American artist from the early 20th century, often you'll see gouache being used. So now we're going to move on to printmaking. And a large part of this module will be focusing on printmaking, partly because there are just so many different types. I also have included it because I think as someone starting an art collection, prints are a great place to start. They're less expensive than drawings or paintings. And after you understand how they're made, you'll really begin to appreciate prints and look at prints probably in a different way. So the first type we're going to talk about is engraving. Engravings are made using a burin, which is this tool seen on the left of your screen. It has this long metal tip. It has a pointed tip at the end, so it's like a triangle. And the handle has almost a ball at the end. And you hold it very differently than you would say hold a pencil. You hold it, you make a fist around the handle. And what the artist does is they take a metal plate, usually copper. They place the pointed tip of the burin into the plate and they push. So it's a very different process than drawing, and it's quite difficult. And as the artist digs into the metal with their burin, they create a line, and a single coil of metal comes out of the plate and is removed. The harder the artist pushes, the deeper the line goes, and ultimately the darker the line will be when it's printed because it's able to hold more ink. Engraving began in the West in the 15th century. However, incising into metal to create designs was not a new concept. In ancient times, the technique was used to decorate metal, and in the Middle Ages, it was used by gold and silversmiths to embellish their work. So, engraving really grew out of goldsmiths' work. The idea of using this technique pictorially, however, didn't really exist until the beginning of the 15th century, and the earliest engraved impressions were produced around 1430. Part of the reason why printing didn't really begin until the 15th century was just due to the availability of paper. So paper was a very valuable commodity during this time. And before this, if you think about manuscripts, medieval manuscripts, they're made on vellum. So paper was not something that was readily available until the 15th, 16th centuries, and even then it was still a very prized commodity. So here's an example on the right of one of the earliest engravings. I'm going to talk about the line a lot when I talk about prints, because in order to identify prints, you have to look very, very closely at them, and you have to look at what the line itself looks like. So for an engraving, particularly these early engravings, the line is very fine. It's short, they're short strokes, it's soft, it's delicate. It has a kind of gray tone overall. There's not a huge distinction between light and dark in this work. As time goes on and you get into the late 16th century, the line of an engraving changes, and you get this tapering and swelling line, which you see in this arm here. This is a detail from a work by an artist named Henrik Holtzius, made at the end of the 16th century. So if you take a look at any of these lines that make up this bulbous, muscular arm, you'll see what I'm talking about when I'm describing this tapering and swelling line. So at the end, the engraver pushes very, very lightly into the plate when he's engraving, and the line is very shallow and light. As he continues, he presses deeper, and the line becomes much darker and wider. So as they vary the pressure in a single line, they're able to create different tones. The line of the engraving is also very clean. It's very straight, which you can see here in this detail. Straight, I mean in terms of the edges of it. We'll look at an etching in a few minutes, and you'll really be able to see the distinction. And you only see this swelling and tapering line in engravings. With engravings, you also get something called a plate mark. So an engraving is a type of print called an intaglio print. Intaglio is sort of an umbrella term for engravings and etchings. And what that means is that you have a plate, you have engraved lines, incised lines, With an etching, you have etched lines, and you put the ink into these grooves. So that's what an intaglio is. And in order to print it, you have to place a lot of pressure on it so the paper goes into these grooves. And that's why you'll have what's called a plate mark on these works. Because the pressure is so strong, the plate itself also makes an impression on a paper. So if you see a plate mark, it's an intaglio print. So here's an example from the early 17th century. This is an example of really engraving taken to its height and the use of a swelling and tapering line at its best. It's a work by a French artist named Claude Mellan. It's called Veronica's Veil. And essentially what you'll see if you look very, very closely at his nose, you'll see that there's one single line that makes up this work. It starts at his nose and he goes around and around and around. And in order to create his various facial features, his nose, his eyes, his mouth, his beard, he varies the amount of pressure that he puts into the plate, so he gets a little thicker line. This is something that is extraordinarily difficult, and Mellan here is really showing off his skills as an artist. So this example really shows what I mean when I say understanding the process of how it's made makes you appreciate a work of art even more, because engraving was a very specialized skill, and in order to create this work, it was a huge amount of work and a huge feat for the artist. And it's, to our contemporary eye, many of us might not want an image of this image hanging on our walls, but it's really an extraordinary, extraordinary work of art and makes us see it in a very different light. Next, we're going to talk about etchings. Etchings are also intaglio prints, but it's a very different process. And I included the web address on the bottom of the screen, which goes to a really great interactive site by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it illustrates how an etching, woodcut, lithograph, and screen prints are made. So as I describe the process, I suggest you go to this website so you can really visualize it. You can also go to it anytime you want. It's a wonderful website. Just go after the lecture, explore a little bit, and get a sense of how prints are made. The first step to making an etching is having a metal plate. You cover it in a waxy, acid-resistant ground. Then you take your etching needle, which I have depicted here on the left of the screen. It's a little bit different than a burin in the sense that it doesn't have a super triangular pointed tip. It's much more similar to a pen, how you would hold a pen or a pencil, and you take the etching needle and you draw onto the plate. And the needle scratches through that waxy ground and it exposes the metal below. The plate is then submerged into an acid bath and the acid eats away at the exposed metal and the waxy ground protects the rest of the plate that hasn't been exposed. So when you remove the ground after you take it out of the acid bath, you have the grooves where you had excised of that waxy ground. You ink the plate, the ink goes into these grooves, and then you pull your image. In order to identify the etched line, let's take a look at this close-up that I have here. You'll see that the line is a little bit scraggly. It's not perfectly straight or fine like the line of an engraving. And this is because of how the acid actually bites into the plate. It's not perfectly straight or refined. Another process that artists use in conjunction with etching is dry point. So the artist adds dry point after the plate has been etched and cleaned of its waxy residue. And they take the etching needle and they scratch directly onto the plate. And unlike an engraving where the metal is excised completely from the plate, and as you engrave, you get this very neat little coil of metal that comes out of it. When you do dry point, the metal actually stays on the plate. So as you scratch, you get these little clumps of metal that gather on the plate. And when you ink the plate, those little pieces of metal soak up all of the ink, and you get these very rich, dark parts of etchings. So if you look at the top example here, you'll see this in just under his beard, that really dark, rich section. You see it also in some of the lines on his collar, where some are a little bit darker and denser. Dry point lines almost have a kind of chewiness to it, if that makes sense. You feel like you can kind of grab it and touch it. You'll see the dry point in the bottom image in the roofs of the different homes, or along the street. Some of the ground is a little bit darker, and that richness is dry point. What happens with dry point, though, is that, and with etchings, but dry point more so, is that it wears down very quickly. So each time you put the metal plate through the printing press, the pressure wears the plate down just a little bit. And dry point goes away very quickly. So when you see an etching and it has this really rich, darkness to it, I should say that the really dark parts of dry point are specifically called burr, B-U-R-R. So you'll see a print described sometime as having really rich burr. That's a really good thing, because print enthusiasts, print collectors, love seeing this darkness. And that's what's wonderful about etchings, is that juxtaposition between light and dark. On that note, one of the greatest etchers and someone who really utilized and exploited light and dark through the medium of etching was Rembrandt. And this is his print, The Three Crosses. The work is entirely done in dry point. This technique gave him a more immediate control of drawing onto the copper plate. However, as I mentioned, the surface wore away very quickly during printing, and much more quickly than just a regular etching. So each time this happened, Rembrandt would go back, he would rework the plate, redraw certain parts of it, and then reprint it. And so that's why you get these differences. So on the left, this is the third state, and on the right, it's the fourth state. What a state is it's that difference between when you have one matrix that has been unaltered and then you change that matrix, it makes it a new state. So essentially it's the same plate, it's the same base of an image, but the artist is going in and slightly altering certain aspects of it. So in these examples, in the fourth state on the right, you see all the figures except for those where the crosses have been scraped away. You have new vertical lines that are scored through the sky. There's this incredible dramatic darkness to it. On the third state, on the left, there's this incredibly bright light which shines down not only on Jesus on the cross, but also on the figures around it, and it's really focusing on the trauma of the scene. On the right, in the later state, it's really just focusing the attention on Christ itself. One of the reasons why Rembrandt made so many different states was also because the market demanded it. The Dutch Golden Age was an age in which there were a lot of shopaholics. They loved collecting. There were a lot of collectors, and one of the things they collected was prints, and Rembrandt was very much aware of this. And the print collectors really adored how Rembrandt would alter these images. And so each time Rembrandt made a new state, they would be purchased. And they wanted the complete set. They wanted state 1, state 2, state 3, state 4, and on. There are, I believe, 6 states of this particular print. Etching, however, did fall out of favor for a time, and it wasn't until the mid-19th century that it came back into prominence. And one of the artists who had a big part in that was a British artist named Francis Seymour Hayden, and this is a work by him. And you really see the similarities between this work and Rembrandt's work. Again, a focus is on the distinction between light and dark. The way that he draw those lines into the center so that you have these rays of light emanating from the sun in the background, really highlighting or drawing your viewer's eye in a very similar way that Rembrandt did. And then you have the dark, chewy burr on the boat and on the landscape in the background. Francis Seymour Hayden admired Rembrandt. Artists of this period really admired Rembrandt and tried to emulate him. Whistler was another artist who was working around this time, and Rembrandt played a huge role in his work. And Whistler also loved making different states of his prints. He also was the first to pioneer the idea of a limited edition print. Nowadays, when we go to purchase a print, we say, oh, how many were actually made? It's an edition of 25, it's an edition of 50, it's an edition of 250, and that helps you understand how many are out there in the marketplace. It helps you understand the value of certain prints. However, when Rembrandt was printing, or before Rembrandt was printing, none of that idea existed. They wanted to print as many as they possibly could so that they could sell more and make more money. It was just a different way of thinking, and Whistler really was a turning point in the history of printmaking and changing how people thought about prints. So to summarize, when you're looking at an etching, you see that scraggly line if you look really closely, and what you're looking for, what makes a great etching, is this lightness, is that darkness, is the juxtaposition between the two, and is that really, really rich burr. That makes your etching really beautiful and extraordinary. So let's move on to woodcuts next. Woodcut is what is called a relief print. Essentially, it's a giant stamp. And unlike etching and engravings, which are intaglio prints and the ink is placed into the recesses in the plate, with a woodcut, the ink is placed on the parts that are not cut away. So the process is an artist draws their design onto the wood block, and then the wood is chipped away. So here's an example of a woodblock print, and you can see this is of a flower, and the artist has gone in and taken away all the little bits of wood that they don't actually want printed. The ink is then rolled onto the parts that are raised. Here there's a beautiful flower, it looks like a chrysanthemum. So the artist would place ink on the flower here, and then paper is applied, and you exert pressure on the top of it, and you have your print. With woodcuts, sometimes you put it through a printing press. Sometimes you don't even need to do that. Like I said, it's like a giant stamp, and how you would do a stamp is you can even do it with your hands. You can apply pressure with a spoon. There are various different ways to actually do that. Again, the Museum of Modern Art website has an illustration of how a woodcut is made, so take a minute and check it out. To give you a little history of woodcuts, woodcuts were developed first from printed textiles. So back in Roman times, textiles were printed from wood blocks that were inked and pressed onto the linen. And the technology for woodblock printing then really existed for a long time. But as I mentioned before, paper was not created in Europe until 12th century. It was not really available until the 15th century. It was a very expensive commodity. So the first major printed image on paper, which was a woodcut, was not really created until, I think it was 1420, between 1420 and 1430. And the beginning of printing on paper was also not without issues. So printers didn't know what type of wood to use, and it's sort of thought that they used pear wood because you had to find a wood that wouldn't break. And that's why when you're looking at a wood block, you often see very thick, chunky lines because of the wood would actually break after it's being printed. This is an example by Albrecht Dürer. This is from 1515. You see it's dated. And it's a little more refined. This is about 100 years after woodblock printing really started, so the lines are a bit thinner. It's a really interesting print historically because Albrecht Dürer had not seen a rhinoceros in person. There was apparently a rhinoceros which was brought to Portugal, I believe, and word traveled throughout Europe and around Europe, and Dürer read a description of what this rhinoceros looked like, and he created an image based on that. So that's why it's a bit goofy looking. But he chose the medium of woodcut because he was also an engraver, and he chose to do a woodcut for this composition because it could be printed in, there could be more printings of it. So another thing that distinguishes woodcuts, engravings, etchings is that when you have etchings and engravings, which are on a metal plate, that wears down much more quickly. Wood is a little sturdier, even if you do have certain times when it breaks, you can still get more prints from a wood block than you can from an engraved plate. And this is why early woodcuts also were used in books, so for book plates and really any image or information that was going to be widely distributed. In the early 20th century, woodblock printing really becomes popular again, and it's picked up by German expressionists. And here's a work by a German expressionist, and again you can see these really clunky, chunky lines. Often you'll see with woodcuts, you can actually see the grain, so that's another way to determine that it's a woodblock print. In the 20th century, you also have a medium called lino cuts, which is the same process, but instead of using a wood block, you use a block made out of linoleum. So you can tell the difference between them because often there's something a bit more organic about wood block printing. So you can see the grain, you'll see little chips. Lino cuts often look a bit more perfect, I guess I should say. But again, a telltale sign are these chunky, blocky lines. Lithography is the next medium that we'll talk about. It was invented around 1796, somewhat by accident. There was a playwright, a Bavarian playwright, who discovered that he could duplicate his scripts by writing them in a greasy crayon on slabs of limestone and then printing them with ink, obviously. And because the limestone retained these crayon marks of these waxy crayons, even after it was inked and printed multiple times, these lithographs could be printed in almost unlimited quantities. So as I was talking about a few minutes ago, woodblock engravings, etchings, all of these things wear down, and blocks break. Engravings, you can't pull many prints from them that are still really readable because the ink becomes very light. So the fact that you could make these lithographs that could be printed in unlimited quantities was huge. So take a look at the Momo site. It's a great visualization of this process. It's complicated. There are a lot more steps because it's based on chemical reactions. So I find the Momo site extremely helpful, even for me to understand kind of what's going on. But I will do my best to describe this right now. So the process is an artist takes an oil-based crayon. He draws on a slab of limestone. So here I have on the screen an example of a limestone with this image. And it's actually inked here, but you get a sense of what the limestone actually looks like. So after they draw on this piece of limestone, the stone is then wiped with a chemical solution, which makes the image attract ink, and the other areas will reject the ink and they'll reject water. The stone is wiped with a solvent to dissolve most of the early drawing, but you have this ghost-like image that remains, which is greasy. The surface is then rubbed with water, and the early treated areas will attract and absorb that water. And then because ink and water reject one another, you can ink the rest of the plate with a roller, and that grease will stick to the crayon and not the areas that have water on them. So then you can pull your image. So thanks to the ease of production and economical distribution, it really didn't take long for lithography to find a broad range of applications in art and commerce, again, because it can be printed in such unlimited qualities. And you saw it would multiply drawings. It was embraced by for portraits, for illustrators, also in the popular press, and it was just a really effective means of creating images for many of the period's greatest artists. And it revolutionized. One of the first places you really see it being revolutionary is in the 1880s and 1890s with posters. So this is an example by Toulouse-Lautrec of a wonderful lithographed poster, which would have been put up around Paris. And lithographs increased the size of the printing base, and art collectors as well really began to enjoy a greater range of offerings in color prints and illustrated books. Another example of a lithograph, this is from the early 20th century. This is a work by George Bellows, who was an extraordinary artist and lithographer, and his lithographs are very highly prized. And again, you see here the difference between this dark and light, which is so apparent in prints and which makes print so sort of wonderful when they are in black and white. And it's just a really dynamic composition and really beautiful, really interesting, intriguing composition. How you can tell lithographs from other prints is that they appear like they were drawn with a crayon. So if you look on the left here, it's almost as if someone had a black Crayola crayon, right, and was drawing on a sheet of paper. It also sometimes looks like graphite, so like a pencil. And on the right, you can kind of see that too. It's like this very light shading in a way. And sometimes you don't get the very strong line that you see in woodcuts and engravings and etchings. So it's a little bit subtler. But again, it looks like a crayon because it essentially was drawn with a crayon. And now we're going to move on to mezzotints. I like to think of mezzotints almost like a print in reverse, because the process is a bit different than engraving or etching. It's made like engraving and etching on a copper plate. But what the artist does is, you'll see here on the left, they take what's called a rocker. And a rocker is that semicircular tool you'll see. It has fine teeth along the bottom. And the artist takes it and kind of runs it across, or rocks it really across the metal plate so the surface is roughened. So in this state, the plate will print in solid black, right? Because this rocker puts little grooves into the plate where ink is held. And what the artist then does is, to create a design, he scrapes down and polishes areas of the plate. So those areas hold less ink and will print more lightly than the unpolished areas. The mezzotint plate is particularly prone to wear during printing because those grooves that the rocker creates aren't really that deep. So the earliest impressions are really fine and really dark, have a very strong contrast, and then they become fainter and fainter. And on the right here, you'll see just how the artist smooths out an image using his various tools. In the 19th century, mezzotints were used in England as portraits. So here's an example of that. And again, with lithographs in a way too, you don't see a huge distinction with line, since the artist is able to create very kind of smooth areas, and it can be very subtle in how the range of the depth of the grooves really is. So the shading can be much subtler. And this is a work by a contemporary artist. And again, you have this dark background, which would have been created using that rocker. And you have this piece of garlic, and you can see just the shading is very subtle, very light. There is a very strong contrast between dark and light here, but when you really look at the specific sections of this piece of garlic, you'll see how subtle the shading actually is. And if you look very closely at mezzotints, you can see those little dots, little specks that hold the ink, which the rocker created. So that's how you can tell a mezzotint from different types of printmaking, because you can see these little dots. And the last kind of printmaking we're going to talk about is screen printing. So screen printing really became popular, and I associate screen printing with contemporary works of art. However, it's one of the oldest forms of printmaking, and really the oldest forms of making art. It dates 1,000 years back to China during the Song Dynasty, and it was the successor of stenciling, which was invented over 40,000 years ago. So those methods are some of the earliest forms of artistic expression, and they really heavily influence artistic innovation throughout history. And you can see some stencils that were used on the walls of European caves. But stenciling really wasn't introduced into Europe until the late 1700s. And it wasn't until the 1910s that printers began experimenting with new ways of screen printing. So they used photoreactive chemicals, with glues, with gelatin compounds, and then you have it being developed even further when three printers, Roy Beck, Charles Peter, and Edward Owens, introduced photo image stencils. So it was at this time when, screen printing and the use of stencils became more of an art form and not such just a industrial product, I guess you could say. So for most of the 20th century, screen printing was considered like trade secrets, and it was very confidential. These new forms that were created and really being used were not widely used. And in the 1960s, however, with the help of Andy Warhol, it became a more widely recognized art form. And here's the process of screen printing. Again, you can go to the MoMA site and you can take a look and see what they say. But essentially the process is an artist draws on a piece of plastic, a piece of paper, cuts away the portions that will be printed, and then you have a stencil. So the stencil is placed on a piece of mesh. It's stretched on a frame. You can see that in this image here, you have this frame around a stencil, the blue plastic. You'll see parts that are cut away, various letters. And then you have ink is placed on the top of the screen, and a rubber blade drags the ink down across the image, printing the areas that have been cut out. So again, here's this artist with his little squeegee almost, and he is running ink down the stencil so that it goes through the cutaway parts and onto the piece of paper down below. And for different colors, you need a different screen and a different stencil. So this became really popular in the 1960s, as I mentioned, and it really, maybe because of the relationship between stenciling and commercial sort of images, but it became really popular in pop art. So this is a work by Tom Wesselman, and with screen printing, you can tell it's a screen print. Well, first of all, you can make very big screen prints, which you can't necessarily do that with, well, you can't, it's much harder to do with other types of printmaking. So screen prints, it's easier to make them very large, which was very popular in the 1960s, very popular today as well in contemporary art. And you also see blocks of color. So you have a block in the lamp with the peach and the red, same with the flower. It's these kind of created out of 3 different colors, really. The curtain in the back it has a sort of flattened look because it's very created with these blocks of colors. So that's really how you can tell a screen print is different from any other type of printmaking. Andy Warhol was, and probably still is, one of the most prolific artists who made many, many screen prints. And what's really wonderful about the works that he made, aside from the impact they have on a wall or their compositions, is how he utilized different colors. And I will personally say I never really liked Warhol, maybe because he's a bit overexposed, but once I really began to learn more about the process of screen printing, I started to look at his works in a very different light. And as with these Marilyn images, he uses color in a really interesting, intriguing way. And if you look very closely, you see just how many colors he really is layering on top of one another, and he would have had to use a different stencil for each and every one of those. So it's really it can be a very intensive and interesting process, and it makes me appreciate his work a lot more. So how can you learn more? There are so many different types of media. I've been talking here maybe about 7 or so today, and there's so much more that you can learn. So on the resources pages, you'll find lots of links to different sites to help you expand your knowledge. And there's also the worksheet. So the worksheet's available on the website. Please fill it out. It's designed to help you retrain your eye to look at art in a new way, where you are looking really at medium first and how the artist uses and appreciates the medium itself in the art. And as you can tell, there are many different processes, and there's a reason why an artist chooses a certain medium over another to depict a composition. So don't forget that when you're looking at a work of art.